Morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Today, we'll be going through the components of endpoint management, but specifically unraveling the unified endpoint management space. You're joined today by myself, Ricky Patel, one of the lead solutions consultants here at Power On, as well as Steve Beaumont, one of the solutions consultants here. So today's agenda, we'll be going through some of the new features, the updates and technologies across each area, what's available, the capabilities and what you can achieve with them, as well as some tips and advice for maximizing your investments within the licensing that you've got and where these technologies could be applied within your organization. Feel free to add questions at any point in the Q&A section, and then hopefully we get a chance towards the end of today's session to kind of go through them. If we don't get a chance, then we'll then respond to any questions over email after today's session. So looking into some of the options that you might have based on the licensing that you have, we'll be going through the E3 space as well as the E5, and Steve will be just kind of looking at some of those components, understanding kind of where they could be used, and equally some of those quick wins that you might be able to benefit from. So Steve, just over to you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Just a quick update on the Q&A section. Just notice it's not appearing on my screen. If for some reason it's not appearing and you do have a question, please just do email it through to ourselves. There'll be some contact details at the end, and we'll generally catch up with them later. So, quick thing on the licensing side, because this generally determines all the different features and functionalities that you have access to. Now, there are two main licensing things that we'll focus on. These can be broken down to much more granular detail, and our previous webinar did go through some of the options you have around making the best choices and the best maximization of your licensing side. The E3 and the E5 from the M365 space is what we'll focus on, but I'm going to move the Office part out of the conversation because we're focused today primarily on that management aspect. And the management aspect focuses purely around the mobility and enterprise security suite side and the Windows side. Now, I do have Defender on here because that obviously starts within the free side. There's a separate webinar where we'll go into much more detail specifically in Defender, because quite rightly so, it deserves its own time space to talk about it and give it justice. Now, out of all of these different things on screen, we've picked a couple of things which are some of the first starting blocks or the most valuable areas that we feel you should really start to focus on to get some of the most benefits back out of your licensing investment. Kind of goes without saying that Intune in its entirety is probably one of the major focus areas to actually start to manage your devices. So we'll dive into that. But specifically, it's been split into multiple different areas now with Intune Plan 1, and we'll talk around some of the P2 in the Intune suite later. Within the Azure AD space, now for those of you that have seen some of the announcement, don't worry, I will keep referring to it as Azure AD for the majority of this, and then I'll mention on what that change is later for those that know about what I'm on about. But we're going to touch on some of the key things within at least the E3 side that you'll have access to around things like App Proxy, Cloud App Discovery, certainly some of the security and identity aspects of conditional access, and then some of the least used things around some of the temporary access passwords and the single sign-on side. Now, Windows is an interesting one because a lot of people just see it as, yep, Windows has its own feature set. We enable it, we use it, and we just carry on as if it's just Windows. But from a licensing aspect, there's some add-on things to Windows that come into play. They could be around the always-on VPN, BitLocker to go that doesn't often get used. Azure AD is a subject that we're passionate about around trying to disjoin from the domain on-premises network. We'll touch around some of the options there. Universal print is within your licensing for Windows, is kind of still a little bit unknown. So we'll touch on some of the benefits that can give, alongside some of the updating and deployment mechanisms that are specifically part of your licensing. So we might as well use them and get some benefits. And one bit that people miss, it includes some virtualization usage rights, and that enables you to use some of the more modern delivery platforms. As I said, all of the Defender side, very, very useful, major benefits included in the free licensing as a starting block. Different webinar to really dive into that, but I do want to call out that if you're not aware, it's there. There is some real good use case scenarios that can be unlocked. And then obviously we have the E5 for those that have got that look enough, that step up within their environment. Take the office bits out of the equation again, and we're focusing down into these two main stacks for the manageability aspect side. So we'll talk around what access reviews and stuff can give us, the MFA policies, risk-based, again, the identity protection piece. I'm not going to go massively into depth in some of this because, again, it depends on whether you need the E5 side. But if you have got it, these are the areas that I personally would recommend that you focus on to get that initial benefit back. And then this little bit on the side for Defender for cloud apps doesn't mean the same as going and using the antivirus and stuff on your devices. This is a solution that can give you some real good insights into what's going on in terms of usage of cloud-based applications, help you build up things like lists of usage apps within your environment for things like cyber essentials that you need to actually know and report on and control. And obviously there's a huge stack of stuff for Defender for Endpoint that come in with the 5 or the Plan 2 step up. While absolutely all of these are really, really good and key, these are, for me, the starting blocks again to start to see some real quick benefits around being able to go and hunt for vulnerabilities if something's happened in your environment, as well as that whole EDR or XDR capabilities of responding to attacks. But the threat and the analytics and vulnerability management side are really useful to start to get even more insight into your estate, what you need to do and what can be done. So let's start picking some of these apart. Now, in terms of the capabilities of some of these things that I've mentioned, where we can start to get them benefits from that licensing investment as soon as possible. It's all about, in my opinion, delivering services to the business. The way we start to look at that is from this aspect of what are the user personas and roles within your environment. These are the important things because it allows us to start to tailor our services to how we deliver them in a specific way, in the right way to the different types of users within our environment. So with a mixture of different users within the environment, obviously the most common one for the bulk of organizations is going to be the information worker, with IT falling into the power user and secure worker as such. Retail industries, manufacturing, you'll see much more of the shared devices and the frontline workers. The majority of what we'll talk about today is predicated around the Windows operating system, 10 and 11. That's not to say that some of the products and solutions don't absolutely, which they do, apply to the wider range of the different types of devices, making sure we have iOS and Android and stuff in the mix. But Windows is the primary thing we'll talk around. And that's typically delivered across physical devices in most organizations. As we start to talk around then modern delivery platforms, from a Microsoft side, we pull into the mix Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365. Now this allows to open up the much different scenarios around, rather than just predicated on a single device delivering Windows as a laptop or a desktop. For them end users that will typically they'll have the requirements for much wider range of devices, be it in a retail situation, having iPads, or not necessarily iPads, sorry, but tablet devices on that frontline side, or having shared devices with thin clients, or just being able to work from home on that bring your own device scenario. Being able to be agnostic around what the device is and choosing the right delivery mechanism, but still having fundamentally the same management platform across all the different delivery platforms makes much more sense of leveraging that licensing investment, looking at how we use the combination of Azure Active Directory, Intune, and Defender for Endpoint to go and do the different things that we need to in terms of provisioning. How do we get an operating system or an access method, so that delivery platform, to the right type of user in the right circumstance as quick as possible without involving lots of manual steps from IT and time to build that up to get it to the end user. We'll talk about lifecycle processes, how we start to unblock them in terms of both the updating, the migration aspect of getting from 10 to 11 to 12 and so forth, the inventory side of it, delivering of applications, enabling that through the different various products. Security controls, both in terms of look and feel, security enablement of features, and just generally be making sure that we're giving it in a secured manner at all times. And then analytics, because at the end of the day, data is king. We can't manage what we don't know. If we don't know if devices are compatible for Windows 11, we'll always be fighting a losing game. So moving ahead then into what that actually starts to look like. Ricky, if you want to go through the changes upcoming for Windows 11, etc.
Yeah, sure thing. So from the Windows lifecycle type of things, a lot of you may be aware of kind of the different iterations of Windows 10 and kind of the end of life of Windows 10 in October 14th, 2025, and then kind of the last version of that Windows 10 being 22H2. So Windows 11 has been out for quite a while now, and now we have more of a stable version for clients to migrate to. But there is a new version coming soon, so 23H2, which we're going to see in the near future. So it could be potential options to start looking at, looking into those as well, and also some kind of echoes of Windows 12 as well, and potential release for maybe mid next year. But there's lots of different types of ways of getting there, from one version of Windows 10 to the next, and equally from Windows 10 to 11 and soon to be 12. And those can be achieved by doing things like feature updates, potential in-place upgrades, but with key considerations being making sure that your end users are not impacted by such a big change, because the look and the feel and maybe some of the additional add-ons and things that come with new operating systems could cause a user impact, as well as things like applications and the compatibility between things like Windows 10 to 11 and so on. But one of the key factors is maybe more of the hardware compatibility side. So similar to what Steve was mentioning in some of the earlier slides about data being king, about maximizing on the analytics tools that you have available to you to find out how ready your hardware is within your environment, so you can understand if devices may need to be refreshed or replaced, and so on and so on. But we'll be delving into more of that in some of the further slides. But Steve, back to yourself.
No worries. I think that is key, and as I say, we will mention more on it, but understanding that there is physical hardware blockers for getting Windows 11 out there on machines, and the very fact that most organizations, if they went through that traditional sort of attrition aspect, with the deadlines coming in, you would be forever marching through, starting to replace devices as quick as possible to meet some of these deadlines. So thinking about how we use some of these tools that we'll dive into or touch on coming up would make sense of how we can speed that aspect up. Now, one of them, if I go to the next slide, is around how we can use some of these more modern delivery platforms to actually speed this up. So if we think about the fact that the majority of time we need to actually get Windows 11 into the hands of users. Traditionally, that's been done by giving them a new device with it and picking select users and hoping that things work, and then spending time helping the users, coming up with solutions almost on the fly to make things work. If we could give a non-invasive method where we can say, here is a virtual desktop, so here's a Windows 365, for example, Windows 11 desktop, very low cost effort to deploy on that side, but the user can then start to use that as their primary device. But when they find something that doesn't work, It's not a case of IT immediately have to rush to go and fix it or give them another device, or the user even having to have two physical devices to switch between, but they can simply close the 365 window and continue with their standard Windows 10 desktop that's been embedded in already. It makes a very compelling method to start doing very quick, easy pilot activities for Windows 11. Now, there are different options in terms of both AVD and Windows 365. I'm not going to dive massively in this one into the intricacies of the costing elements between them, because whereas Windows 365 is done on basically a flat fee per month, regardless of how much you use it, whereas AVD is done much more on a per usage basis, so you pay for what you use. It means that there are options, and depending on the target audience usage, between things like call centers, shared users and stuff, or seasonal workers, where you can scale them depending on your needs. So AVD scales up and down a lot easier, whereas 365 is much more that traditional per user, per personal desktop. But there are some stuff that have just come through specifically for frontline workers or shift workers, where if you have different people that can share a license that aren't using it at the same time, there's some different options around there. But it's about that flexibility to choose the right tooling for the right use case scenario rather than a one size fits all. But it does allow you to standardize that connectivity with these modern delivery mechanisms. So you can look at having a standardized way of bringing in partner workers, for example, or contractors, no longer needing to either trust the devices they're working on or ship them physical devices. You just have a very quick, easy to spin up remote connectivity method that can be used the same across all of your internals and contractors, and bring your own device scenarios. But the good thing is all of these are based on that familiar tooling across the board management from Intune, AAD, and Defender for Endpoint, regardless of whether it's a physical device or an AVD or Windows 365. So you're not having to reinvent your management plane, your security controls, just to bring in a different modern access method. Now, mentioning the whole management side, Ricky, if you want to dive into this.
Yeah, sure thing. So just taking Steve's last point about kind of that familiar tooling side of things, and specifically within the Intune space. So when it comes to things like modern management, the aim here really is how do we enhance kind of the features that we're currently using to better kind of methodologies and processes, allowing you to then manage devices from anywhere and across different types of platforms, like you can see on the screen. And by doing so, we want to ensure that devices are both secure and protected within the Intune space and beyond, and introducing factors like conditional access and things like Defender to make sure that we're preventing things like vulnerabilities from accessing your environment. But one of the key items that is sometimes maybe forgotten is we look to ensure that the operating system is protected and patched and up to date. There's also a big component of third-party applications existing on devices, as kind of without them, sometimes we can't do some of the activities that we intend to do. So there is different toolings that can be added on to Intune to ensure that third-party applications are patched and up to date, and equally supporting them in the same way that you would for the operating system, so those kind of monthly updates and feature updates and so on. But moving into the analytics piece that we mentioned on some of the previous slides, it's a lot harder to really understand some of the decisions that need to be made for the organization when it comes to things like costs or applications and security if we don't know what's going on. So similar to that Windows lifecycle slide, we really want to know what devices are compatible and are not, and if so, then how many devices we may potentially need to replace, and equally, is there an opportunity to have a look at things like AVD and Windows 365 to get the operating system out to end users.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of going to be a running theme across this side. So while there's lots of different components and there's places to start, and we'll talk around some of the places to start later, It's best when you start to tie everything together. So we'll see on that one, we mentioned around the whole secure and protect. While configuring the policies on the actual physical device is one thing, we lock that device down, but starting to look at then merging it in with conditional access and the threat management side of the defender side, and being able to send a health attestation of that device that can be used with the front door access with conditional access makes that even more robust control side. So as we move on to some of the Azure AD stuff, you'll be not surprised to see that I've got things like conditional access in there. Because this is changing that aspect of, while previously we were worried around devices just sat inside of our network with some group policies on, they're locked down, you can't do anything bad on it. So you shouldn't be able to do anything bad on it. Because these devices are now all over the place and we have much less of a concept of a physical boundary, we need to make sure that the identity plane is being the thing that controls these devices and the users on them coming in through our front door and accessing our data and our applications, which is where we start to use conditional access across. But that then ties into that whole app delivery. So again, previously, everything was on premise. We only had to worry about these devices coming across our LAN and accessing it in the backend data center on the server. Now we talk much more about understanding what applications that are being accessed either as a service up in the cloud, or how we get our internal web apps and stuff out to these devices that are basically out on the internet. So app proxy within the AAD side often gets forgotten about, but it's a much simpler mechanism to be able to deliver a web-based application out to a device without the need for VPN connectivity. This is where we're trying to whittle down a little bit the whole need for VPNs wherever possible. They won't go away entirely until you do a big transformation project and remove the data centers, but trying to blend the access mechanisms to do less reliance on them. And this is where AOVPN does come into play as well, where we can start to look at much more of the drive towards using a simplistic VPN access without the reliance on third-party hardware and software. But app proxy allows us to get an easy head start for delivering simple web applications out. But then cloud-based applications. So it's twofold, able to understand what our end users are accessing out there on the internet. What have they signed up for? Are they using Adobe Creative Cloud on the web? Are they using Miro? They're using any number of different cloud-based applications. Are they just completely islands of information? Are they tied into our identity plane? What control do we have? And this again comes back to the whole mantra of data is king. Being able to use the cloud discovery aspects that are present within your licensing to at least gain an understanding of what is out there, what systems and who are using them, and then start to leverage things like Defender for Cloud to be able to apply controls around them to either block them entirely or enforce things like conditional access, MFA access, and tie that in with the whole Azure AD single sign-on and provisioning so that we can ensure that we're using the same identity, which helps both IT from a control and compliance aspect, but also allows us to simplify the end user experience because we want to make it seamless for them to log on. We don't want them to have to remember they use this email and that password that's unique to that application over there. We could be saying, this is your corporate identity. That just signs you into that approved, authorized, allowed application. So key and critical to discover what's out there, use the cloud app discovery capabilities of Azure AD, and then control access and mechanisms using Defender for Cloud Apps alongside the Azure AD single sign-on provisioning for experience and control, and app proxy for your internal apps. Now, multi-factor authentication should these days be at a bare minimum enabled for all of your users. Anyone that is subject to going through regulatory compliance, things like NCSC and stuff, will find that that is now a hard and fast must be enabled, no exceptions. Now, there's a drive to use more of the authenticator style application on your mobile phones for doing that MFA. And that is even at the very basic level, if you don't have E3, it's still there and available to use from the Azure AD basic side. So it's still there, still be used with just the authenticator. The extra permissions within E3, so the P1, P2 with AAD, do allow you to use different mechanisms such as text message based authentication and phone. However, they are being looked at as less security conscious for orgs to use. There are risks involved, but again, it's like anything, it's about what your risk profile and appetite within your business is as to whether to still use them. But it's a recommendation to start to use the Authenticator app, and specifically number matching, which is now enforced by Microsoft as default for the vast majority of use case scenarios. And then start looking at the different options around FIDO2 capabilities. So these are your like little USB sticks that you have to tap and all the rest of it, similar to what we used to have back in the days with the RSA with revolving tokens, but much more of a physical device access mechanism, which can help you move towards passwordless in the future. Now, stepping up the stack slightly, so certainly within the E5 or the Azure AD P2 stuff, you get a load of cool stuff around identity protection. So this is a bit more of a later stage deployment as you go through the minimum sides of MFA, conditional access, and controlling your apps. This allows you to actually just put some risk-based analysis regarding what's going on within your environment. So you can actually start to see where users are signing on from. Is that not somewhere that you usually do business, a geolocation? Is it impossible to geographically travel from when you signed on down in Slough in London and all of a sudden you're signing on across in Switzerland, for example? These controls combine with the fundamental layers that you put in around conditional access, etc., to block it on a risk-based approach rather than a carte blanche style approach. Now, as a quick win, I'm hoping most organizations have self-service password reset enabled within their environments. So this is part of the E3 or the P1 side of the licensing scheme. It's pretty quick to get in, get done, but has a lot of benefits, especially when we start to talk about user experience, reducing support calls on the service desk, and it's almost a no-brainer in case of getting that in. And then especially when you start to get more towards the usage of multi-factor authentication, and we can talk about temporary access passwords, but making it a method that allows you to pass as much of that time to resolve down to the end users and let them get on with it is just, it's win-win as far as I'm concerned. Like I say, if that's not in, put it high on your radar because it's dead easy to get in, get done, and has loads of benefits. Now, temporary access passwords. So this is something that often gets forgotten about. Like I say, this is about making usage of some of the stuff that you have access to. So this allows us to do lots of weird and wonderful things, lovely things. That again is about easing both the IT admin overhead, increasing the security posture, and also making it a better experience for end users. So usually, if something goes wrong with MFA, you're going to send somebody home to go and get, or if they've forgotten their phone, they ring up and say, I can't work today. I've just driven an hour into the office, but I left my phone. That's got my authenticator app in. Turn it off for me. That's really not advisable. And you don't want to send them back for another hour's drive to then drive another hour back into the office, because that's just a waste of time. But being able to issue temporary access passwords so that they can get on and use it for a limited time period can help to mitigate scenarios like that. as well as being able to say on that new user experience side, when somebody joins, the usual mechanism is IT will create a randomized password to give them for a one-time use. In reality, how randomized that is debatable. It could be as simple as something as the service desk get used to typing in, it is August 23 exclamation mark, or something simplistic like that to save the having to remember or getting the users confused with what they're typing in. And then we're relying on users changing that password and so on and so forth. Being able to quickly and easily generate a temporary access password, which especially for the user onboarding experience would then force them to go through the MFA enrollment, force them to change it, is a much better experience than relying on service text and stuff to set a randomized, he says in air quotes, password for that first time usage. So it is something that's there, it's just there generally to be used, doesn't require major setup, it's just either on or off at the end of the day, but something well worth looking into just to ease the IT admin overhead as well as simplify the user experience. So obviously we talked around the modern delivery mechanisms, the Intune stuff that you have access to, the AAD side. We did mention that Windows focus element. Ricky, did you want to go through this or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. Happy to go through this one, not a problem. So similar to what Steve was mentioning in the previous slide, especially with the big focus in regards to the Azure AD side of things, one of the big factors is connectivity. So how do we start to break away from our on-premise infrastructure and resources and things like applications with more of a direction towards things like Azure AD? So in the interim, technologies such as always-on VPN could definitely support in those scenarios, providing your end users with a seamless approach to access some of those resources. With some of the newer features such as secure gateway coming in and into preview and things like that, making that process even more seamless and with maybe reduced infrastructure. But there is things like virtualization rights, which definitely gives you options on things like the delivery mechanisms and virtualizations and those types of components. But one of the big factors and time-consuming items might be that end users are having to go into the office to then pick up a device and then take it home and so on and so on if there is no connectivity. But that definitely on the autopilot side of things can definitely free up IT from having to stay in build rooms, monitor and manage the builds and provisioning of devices, especially when things like autopilot can allow them to ship the devices directly to the end users. And that could also play a component in the Azure AD side of things. And equally, if there is hybrid scenarios that are required for maybe the interim, then AOVPN works very well into that. But you've got also other components like universal print. So Steve mentioned this one in the earlier slides when we were going through some of the licensing SKUs, but it's a little known solution really, but it really helps when it comes to allowing you to print from anywhere and the capabilities of that really. So this will really prevent the requirement from having line of sight to things like print servers and having the requirement for some of them at all. But it's going through to kind of life cycle and the updating of devices. So I know we've gone through this already quite a bit, but there's different ways of doing this, and either that is using things like Windows Update for Business and Auto Patch can really simplify that update process and make that task even easier for ourselves and less disruption for our end users, and by doing so, maybe not requiring things like WSUS anymore and the requirement for having connectivity to on-premise resources as those tools are operating within the cloud space. I don't know, Steve, if there's anything that you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, a couple of things. So we mentioned that secure gateway side. So that's some new technology that is just coming through and in. Now, slightly unclear on the full extent of the licensing side, but it's believed that there's going to be some usage rights within the current E3 licensing. Now, this is, in essence, there's a couple of threads on this one, but it's about, again, managing access to resources, regardless of whether they're on premises so that traditional sort of VPN access side, or public based, so just wanting to be able to control what we traditionally do through like proxy servers, etc. So that's a very interesting one to keep an eye on. But in essence, you can think of it almost like that, as we mentioned, that app proxy on steroids. So expanding it past just being able to provide access to web applications, and then start to say, well, actually, I just want to access a file server. I don't want a full VPN. I just want something that's simplistic and almost built into the OS, so the users can seamlessly, in conjunction with checking things like conditional access, MFA rights and stuff, am I allowed to access that file server without exposing it generally to the entire internet? So very key to keep an eye on that side of it as you progress through simplifying VPNs with AOVPN, and then keep marching forwards as that technology evolves. Just wanted to drop another one on the universal print as well. So like I say, this is not widely and massively known and adopted at the minute. It's kind of like sat in the background and Microsoft aren't massively shouting about it. So there's twofold for me. Being able to not rely on having to have line of sight to them print servers is one thing. So I want to be able to be sat at home and say, right, I still need to print this document to our big laser color multifunction printer. What they have added recently is also the capability to do the whole print but don't release until I'm at the printer. So you can now walk up to the printers. So where you have solutions like follow me printing and all the rest of it, that you can print, go to the printer, and then in this instance, you basically scan a QR code on your phone, which then will release that print when you're physically there. So you can show everything into a queue while you're at home, go into the office as you're prepping for a meeting, release it, print it, and use it at that point. And then, as you mentioned, Ricky, on the whole lifecycle side, just from a personal note, WSUS for me is such a house of cards at the best of time. So having to water and feed and maintain that just to make sure that I can get patches out to the environment, as well as selectively checking, approving, knowing what updates are going out, and that overhead, anything that can be used to simplify that and give a good user experience with decent built-in notifications and countdowns and all the rest of it, and trying to reduce the amount of effort it takes to get patches out to devices, is again a win-win for me. But the information that it flows back into the service that can be used for reporting, down to what's going on, did it fail to download the patch for a change? Did it fail to have enough time to reboot? Has the user refused to turn the machine on or not even used it enough? These are key bits of information that we don't usually have access to, even when using Config Manager in that much of a granular detail, that Microsoft are doing analytics in the back end and then presenting that back so we can understand what's going on. Cool. Ricky.
So what's new? So there's lots of features and updates coming within this space. Some of you are already aware of some of the items that Steve mentioned in earlier slides about the Azure AD name change and kind of some of the components coming to the Intune space. So things like sorry, Steve.
Sorry, I was just going to say something that I'm kind of passionate on, so I'll cover this one if you don't mind. So that I mentioned it right at the beginning. I will and do continue to refer to it as Azure Active Directory or AAD. Microsoft, if you haven't seen, and they keep on shouting about it more and more, so I'm presuming just about everyone's seen it now, they have renamed a lot of the stuff that's related to identity to basically come under this Entra or Entra. I think it's supposed to be related to entrance to your environment, so Entra ID. It all comes under this banner now, but you'll see lots of different subsections as they talk about Entra ID, lifecycle governance and things like that. But anywhere that you see Azure Active Directory or AAD, it will be synonymous now with Entra ID. So it's just a branding change at the moment, nothing extra coming across that. apart from what they're doing with the life cycle governance stuff and starting to split that out a bit more. Now, there's a couple of key things that have just done. These are like the stuff that's just come through in this last month. If I was to go through a general thing of everything they've done this last year, we'd be here all day. But some of the key things that you may not have seen because they are really, really new are related to things like the My Apps side. So if you haven't used this, there is literally a URL called myapps.microsoft.com. And this is kind of represented wherever you are in the main portals for like SharePoint and the Office files with that little waffle, where this can actually take you to a dedicated page where previously it was just like, here's all of your AAD. So if you've integrated them cloud apps with SSO, it's a landing page for you to see both the Microsoft apps and your corporate third-party cloud apps. What they've done is they've just refreshed that. So we now have a little bit more control over the look and feel. Whereas before it was just, here's everything, and it could get quite cluttered. You can now kind of actually restrict it and say, I want this section dedicated at the top for just the Office apps or our line of business apps. And I want this page displayed, I want that page displayed, as well as a little bit of tweaking. And the good thing is now that is also defined as a separate app for conditional access policy usage. So if you want to be less restrictive on getting to that initial page and then control the access behind the scenes to the individual apps, if it's like a security tooling, you'll want to put more restrictive access around getting into that than say just the landing page which shows you the apps. So we can now granularly control it. And talking about conditional access, there is this new thing around protected actions. So whereas previously we would generally tend to target a role, so if you're an Intune admin, let's make sure that you have to use passwordless and a FIDO2 key and only from the UK office and only on a privileged access workstation and so on and so on. This allows us to go much more granular now and say, well, actually, you might find that an admin might not necessarily be in the full actual Intune admin role, but they might have either a custom role or they're using a cloud app to run specific actions against like the Graph API for doing a delete operation, or they have a cleanup script. So we can now put the conditional access controls on specific actions regardless of the actual role. You can even use it in combination actually and say, well, fine, we want to make sure that the Intune admin role must be accessed from a compliant corporate device, but if they perform a delete action while in that role, then they must be prompted for MFA to prove that they are who they say they are. So it just allows much more granular control over the user experience on that. And obviously I'm talking and targeting admins at the minute, but that could be done in any sort of instance. You might want to say, well, normally users only get prompted once for MFA in a 7-day period, but if they go to delete an M365 group or a SharePoint site or a Teams site or something, we're going to target the delete operation within the graph and prompt them for MFA on deleting a team, for example, just to give us a little bit more control and reassurance. Sounds like a minor thing, but along with the recent changes, we just get a lot more company branding controls. So they've revamped some of that. So rather than just purely having a logo or the background on certain pages, we now have even more control to go and investigate around that. Mention it because, again, it's one of the things where quite often that'll get set up when you very first set up Azure Active Directory and never really thought about again until there's a rebranding exercise. So it's good just to kind of highlight that these things do evolve and change. So having that knowledge to go in and make the best use of some of them changes just makes sense. On the Intune side, again, these are just 3 things I picked out from the very recent changes. Otherwise, if you haven't seen Intune in about 6 months, I can guarantee there is a raft of features that may fill some of the stuff that you were previously missing when assessing it. However, these 3 for me, they sound really lightweight, but they're actually really useful. So there are some new options around turning off the Microsoft Store app. So currently, the approach of being on specifically a Windows 11 device as an example. The app would be there, you would launch it. Because they deprecated the idea of the private store, you would just get a big message just saying basically, no, you can't access this. Still have things that you could click on the sides, but just no functionality. Wasn't a good user experience. However, if you deliberately tried to remove that app or restrict it, you would also damage further down the stack some of the options for the new winget capabilities for delivering applications. Or if you just had the enable private store access, you wouldn't limit the winget and users could still go and install something from the command line. This new option in effect gives us what we need, which is disable all the mechanisms for end users while still allowing us to use them in the back end with Intune to deliver applications. Now, uninstall apps. Sounds like something that should have been in the product for many, many years. Conversely, it's not been in the product for many, many years, and it's never really blocked any major scenarios. So you could argue, not actually needed. However, my personal opinion, it's really nice to finally see it in the product. There are times, especially as a techie, that I go in and it's like, well, actually, I don't want that application anymore. I want to remove it. Power users especially. It saves on having to make sure that we're forcing an uninstall as an admin across the board or targeted groups. And again, just giving that user experience a little bit of a boost to allow them to do it themselves. And then on the admin side, there was previously, when you had things in autopilot and Intune, cleaning up was a bit of a pain because you had to do it in a certain order. If you did want to test something or you wanted to re-input hardware hashes from autopilot, you had to basically take the machine entirely out of scope of all management, remove it, just to delete the record. We now can just go in and delete the autopilot records without having to manage it from Intune first. Sounds again minor, but much needed for admins, especially when they're testing, etc. One thing I will call out though is if you've built any dynamic groups for targeting of policies and applications on that, just be careful, because if they're targeted at things like the autopilot tag, if you remove it from autopilot, that device then doesn't have that tag anymore. It will fall out of scope of them groups, and then that device will not get policies and applications deployed to it. So just be careful to assess how you built your groups in the first place. And then I'll hand back to you, Reki, to do some of the Intune add-on conversations.
Sure thing. So, like some of you may be aware, there's lots of new features coming to the Intune space. There's kind of multiple different SKUs that have been added. So things like Intune Plan 1, Plan 2, and the Intune Suite. So if you have Intune today, you could add some of these features on as things like standard add-ons, or equally, if you're looking to maybe take on a couple of these features, there is some of them that are grouped together within Plan 2, with all of them being within the Intune Suite itself. But just starting with things like the advanced endpoint analytics piece. So similar to endpoint analytics today, but just going that one level further, just making sure that you're aware of kind of what's going on within your devices within the Intune space. So being able to say, understand what those unusual behaviors are that could be potential threats to the environment, be able to do things like custom scoping. So maybe able to say tie a group of devices together for certain sets of administrators. So maybe for clients with different opcos and things like that, may be really useful to have. And then also the device timeline. So being able to see kind of when the device was working completely fine and where maybe those troubles started to occur for those end users, allowing you to then troubleshoot further into kind of what those issues might be. You've also got things like remote help, so very similar to other remote tools that you may already have in place today, with the main intention of it to be able to be delivered from Intune itself. So be able to have that secure remote access control over the devices, be able to provide you with just kind of quicker, more efficient access to those devices, allowing you to then manage those devices from anywhere. You've also got components of things like endpoint privilege management, so similar to other products that you may already see in the market today, but being able to reduce the attack surface area. So we're basically reducing limiting the amount that the end users can do, but not restricting them from being able to say request for access or elevation for them to be able to install maybe certain applications, which could definitely then reduce the impact that may have on certain support desks by reducing the amount of tickets that are maybe logged for them. Then you've got things like Microsoft Tunnel as well. So this is kind of really big, especially within the mobile app space, especially when it comes to things like mobile devices. So this add-on really help with being able to provide your end users with accessing on-premise resources from their mobile devices. So from devices that may be running iOS, so there's iPads and equally Android, be able to authenticate to corporate resources using things like a single sign-on and conditional access. But it's not limited to just applications. You can set that Microsoft Tunnel up for the entire device itself, depending on how much control and restrictions you would like to apply. And then the more recent one that's just been added to the mix is the specialized device management. So for some of those devices like HoloLenses maybe, or Surface boards and so on, there's now additional security configuration within the Intune space, allowing you to then add additional controls, ensuring that they're equally secure.
Yeah, it's probably key to say as well that this is a starting point for Microsoft in terms of extra add-ons to Intune. And I know there's some more stuff coming down the pipelines in terms of application, third-party app patching and packages. It'll be interesting to see what catalog that unleashes and eases the speed to deliver things like Adobe Acrobat and stuff to your environments. But the timeline stuff within the advanced analytics, that's really awesome to be able to see exactly what sort of events are going on, what application crashes you've had, why, from a troubleshooting aspect and performance analytics and user experience. It's really nice to see that type of information coming through and what Microsoft will potentially do with some of the AI on that side.
So then just moving into things about tips and some of the advice that we've given to a lot of our clients that we're in conversation with today, and how they could begin to start maximizing on their existing investments within either E3 or E5, specifically within that lifecycle management space. So Steve, if you just roll on to the next slide, please. So when it comes to lifecycle management and what organizations are looking to do and hoping to do is to really ensure that their devices and applications are kept up to date, and that there's a proven driven process in place, reducing the overall management of devices. But the only way that can really work is by having that process in place. So ensuring that we're able to get those feature updates out there, ensuring that devices are compliant against various guidelines and security standards. But when it comes to the big 5 things that lots of IT teams really care about is time, effort, efficiency, risk, and user satisfaction. And by doing so, it'll allow teams to reduce the time it could take to upgrade devices and equally patch them, reduce the effort that is required to prepare and validate certain types of deployments, and then building in that efficiency into the mix, so removing some of those manual steps that are being carried out from maybe a day-to-day perspective and changing them to more of an automated process. So having maybe automatic rules in place or triggers in place based on certain actions occurring. And then reducing the risk really of things like failed deployments and user downtimes and having to maybe roll back from one version of Windows 10 to the next, or equally 11. And to really make sure that the end users are happy, because at the end of the day, we're making these changes to our end users, and we need to ensure that they're able to continue working and carry out their day-to-day activities without having to maybe take the time out to resolve issues on their devices and to maybe not be happy with their new ways of accessing things or the way that things look. But that's really what we're seeing within this space, and more of a lots of items within your licensing today can really help to maximize and ensure that things are becoming more efficient and there's less risk involved when it comes to making some of these changes.
Yeah, I think that's key with some of the bits that we've been talking around, working specifically across the things like the effort, the efficiency and stuff, being able to simplify that device provisioning aspect, having it in the case of autopilot, all the modern delivery mechanisms. So we're getting that efficiency rather than IT having to unbox devices, put them on the bench, maintain the task sequences, build them, then package them back up. Just to ship them out there or just drop them into a group and say, head to this URL or this app to gain access. Reduces both the effort internally, the time it takes to get them out to there, the user satisfaction because they feel they can self-service and get it, along with when you tie that into things like the Windows Update side, reducing the risk of deployment failures because you don't have that on-premise infrastructure to water, feed and maintain. The efficiency of being able to make sure that it's just out there regardless of whether they're connected to a VPN. Looking at things like not joining in the first place your devices to the on-premises network, looking at taking the actual time to understand what your requirements are for on-premises access and deliver different delivery mechanisms available within your licensing investment just makes much more sense to try and use some of or all of the things that we've been discussing in a structured manner to build up this story. Now, Ricky, I think we may possibly agree on this side. Hopefully you agree because it's that standard sort of approach. But making sure that you don't just go in with a single tool set mind and go, this tool will solve the problems, but look at how it sits within the actual overarching solution. Make sure the foundation of your identity is in place, your control mechanisms, the knowledge of your data when it comes to what apps, where, what's been accessed, etc., to implement the controls regardless, and understanding how users need to access it for delivery mechanisms. It just builds up across that storyline as we look at how to deliver some of this, which makes it solution intent rather than just purely a tool set intent of what you have available within your investment.
Definitely agree with that. Just moving on to the last couple of slides now. So if you'd like to know more about kind of what we've discussed in today's session, please check out our previous blogs and some of the demos that we've got, and we'll be sending some of them within the chat as well. After today's webinar, you'll also receive an email, so feel free to simply hit reply and send us any additional questions, or we can arrange any calls and those types of bits. But really, thank you all for joining. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar within the next 24 hours. And just looking at the Q&As, we're all good. And we'll be responding to the Q&As just because just a bit tight on time today.
Excellent. So this is obviously part of a different new series that we're doing, that we're building up the story as we go along. We've obviously touched on some topics today without diving massively into depth of it as we build up the content across this side. So thank you very much for joining us on this side. There'll be some further follow-up webinars where we start to go into things like Defender and other technology sets in more detail, individually breaking down. And as Ricky mentioned, please look at our previous webinar that was talking purely about the licensing side, which then has led us into some of the capabilities and stuff on this session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.